Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, how well do you truly know the names you trust each day? A signature, a fine coat, a confident hand upon the page? Watson learned that paper itself can lie, though ink rarely lies twice to a careful eye. Do subscribe so no forged page escapes your notice. Now, look closer, for as Holmes believed, the truth is written between the lines, not upon them. Find us always on the Watson's Margin Spotify channel. Chapter 1. The Gentleman of Wapping. It was a raw evening in November, the fog rolling thick and yellow off the river, when I found Sherlock Holmes seated before the fire at Baker Street, in a posture I had come to recognise as one of concentrated interest. About him, in a disorder that only he could navigate with any confidence, lay a scattering of shipping advertisements, port schedules, and the sailing notices of half a dozen companies trading between London and the continent. "You are studying the tides, Holmes," said I, settling into my accustomed chair, "or else contemplating a holiday upon the sea, which I confess would surprise me more than any case you have yet undertaken." "Neither, Watson, though I thank you for the diversion of the thought." He did not look up from the paper in his hand. "I am attempting to understand a curious feature of maritime commerce, namely that a ship's manifest is at once the most official and the most vulnerable of documents. It is trusted absolutely and guarded carelessly. A fertile combination, is it not, for a man of ingenuity?" I might have pressed him further, but at that moment we heard the bell below, followed by the measured tread of Mrs. Hudson upon the stair, and a moment later she announced Sir Edmund Harcourt. He was a tall man of perhaps 60 years, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in the manner of one who had never in his life doubted his place in the world. Yet on this occasion his composure sat upon him uneasily, like a coat cut for another man's shoulders. "Mr. Holmes," said he, taking the chair Holmes indicated, "I come to you upon a matter which, though it may appear trivial to the police, threatens to undo the work of 3 generations." "Pray begin at the beginning, Sir Edmund," said Holmes, "for I have found that the middle of a story is rarely where its truth resides." Sir Edmund folded his gloved hands. "I am chairman of Harcourt and Bell Maritime, a firm my grandfather founded, and which has never, in 70 years, suffered a breath of scandal. 10 days ago, my vessel, the Caledonia, under Captain Nathaniel Briggs, returned from Antwerp. A customs clerk at the docks, a young man named Julian Mercer, discovered that 1 page of the passenger manifest had been altered. The entry in question concerns Mr. Adrian Vale, a textile merchant of excellent standing, who is recorded as having returned to London aboard her. And this Mr. Vale disputes the entry? He denies it entirely, and with every appearance of honest indignation. He's a gentleman well known in the city, offices near Leadenhall Street, a member of 2 respectable clubs, a generous subscriber to charitable dinners. There is nothing whatever against his character. That, Mr. Holmes, is precisely what troubles me. If a man of such unimpeachable reputation can be falsely entered upon our books, what confidence can the government place in us when we treat for the new mail contract? You fear scandal more than smuggling. I fear, said Sir Edmund gravely, that the mere suggestion of unreliable records will do us more harm than any actual crime could accomplish. Inspector Lestrade believes the alteration to be a case of commercial fraud, possibly connected to young Mercer's evident dislike of Mr. Vale. There is, I'm told, some private history between them. Mercer's sister was for a time courted by Vale, and the courtship ended badly. Holmes's eyes had taken on that bright inward look I knew so well. "Tell me, Sir Edmund, who else figures in this affair?" "Captain Briggs, naturally a most reliable officer of 30 years' service. Mr. Percival Shaw, our chief clerk, a man of scrupulous exactness who prepares the manifests. Miss Eleanor Bell, daughter of my late partner, who oversees our accounts and has, I may say, a sharper eye for figures than any man I have employed, and Mr. Vale himself, of course, together with young Mercer." "A full company," Holmes murmured. "And yet you say nothing is known against Vale?" "Nothing whatever. He's precisely what he appears to be." "That," said Holmes with the faintest of smiles, "is the very feature of the case which recommends it to me. A forged document is common enough, Sir Edmund, but a man about whom everyone is remarkably certain. That is a rarer curiosity. I will look into the matter." Sir Edmund rose, visibly relieved, and had very nearly reached the door when Holmes called after him a question so trifling that I confess I thought it merely a courtesy. "One moment, Sir Edmund. What colour gloves does Mr. Vale commonly wear?" Our visitor turned, plainly puzzled by so odd an enquiry. "Grey, I believe." "Yes, grey kid gloves." "Why do you ask, Mr. Holmes?" "No particular reason," said Holmes lightly, though I observed that he made a note of it upon his cuff. "Good evening, Sir Edmund. You shall hear from me directly." When our visitor had gone, I turned to my friend. What can gloves possibly signify in a case of forged shipping papers? Holmes knocked out his pipe against the grate and began, with evident enjoyment, to refill it. "Perhaps nothing, Watson. Perhaps everything. It is a peculiarity of my method that I collect small facts long before I know which of them will prove to be pearls and which mere grit. But consider this. Sir Edmund came to us fearing a forgery that damages his firm's reputation. Yet the forgery, as he describes it, does no such thing. It merely records that a respectable merchant travelled upon a ship he says he did not board. Why should anyone trouble to invent so modest and so easily disproved a falsehood? Unless, said I slowly, the falsehood is not modest at all, but serves some purpose we have not yet perceived. Just so. Holmes struck a match, and in its brief flare his sharp features seemed carved from something harder than flesh. Everyone in this affair is certain of what Adrian Vale is. I confess myself far more interested in what he was. Outside, the fog pressed close against the windows, and somewhere beyond it, unseen, the river carried its ships down toward the sea, each one bearing upon paper a record of every soul aboard her. Records that men trusted, Holmes had said, precisely because they so rarely thought to question them. Chapter 2. A man of excellent reputation. The offices of Harcourt and Bell stood apart from the clamour of the wharves, a fact which I took, at first, for mere accident of geography, though Holmes remarked as we approached that the distance was deliberate. A shipping firm that wishes to appear ancient and trustworthy does well to keep its counting-house well away from the smell of tar, said he, glancing up at the handsome Georgian facade. Notice how the brass is kept, Watson. Not merely clean, but worn smooth in the manner of long use. Tradition, like a good coat, must be broken in. Within we found ourselves in a long-panelled room hung with the portraits of former directors, each gentleman regarding us with the same expression of settled and hereditary confidence. It was into this atmosphere of unhurried respectability that Mr. Adrian Vale was shown to meet us. I had expected, I confess, some trace of anxiety in a man under suspicion of smuggling, however unjustly. I found instead a figure of remarkable composure. Vale was perhaps 35, of middling height, dressed with the quiet exactness of a man who has never had to think twice about his tailor. His voice, when he spoke, carried the unhurried vowels of a good English education, and his manner throughout our interview was that of a gentleman inconvenienced rather than accused. "I can only suppose, Mr. Holmes, that someone wishes to see me ruined," said he, producing from a leather case a sheaf of letters, invoices and cards of introduction, which he laid before us with the patient thoroughness of a barrister assembling evidence. "Here is my correspondence with the Antwerp House of Van Doren. Here my bank's confirmation of the relevant transactions. Here letters of introduction to 3 city clubs. I have never in my life set foot upon the Caledonia." "You suspect a particular hand in the matter?" asked Holmes. Vale hesitated with what I took for delicacy. "I do not like to make accusations, Mr. Holmes, but there is a young customs officer, a Mr. Julian Mercer, who has shown me considerable hostility of late. I had, some months ago, the acquaintance of his sister, Miss Clara Mercer. The acquaintance ended, and not, I think, entirely to her brother's satisfaction. He accosted me in the street only last month with language I should be ashamed to repeat. It was, I own, a plausible account, and Inspector Lestrade, whom we found already at the offices, embraced it without reservation. "It's as plain as the nose on your face, Mr. Holmes," said he, drawing us aside. "Young Mercer's been nursing a grievance, and what better revenge than to plant Vale's name on a forged manifest and set the customs house buzzing about smuggling? I've known jealousy do stranger things." Captain Briggs, summoned to confirm the point, proved a weathered, plain-spoken man who supported the theory without hesitation. I recall Mr. Vale coming aboard at Antwerp for a brief word with my purser, but he did not sail with us. I'd stake my command upon it. Percival Shaw, the clerk, added his own careful testimony, that the manifest lay open to alteration only during a narrow interval at the customs house itself, before it was sealed for the crossing. Every fact arranged in this manner pointed with tidy unanimity toward Julian Mercer. I remarked as much to Holmes as we made our way back through the panelled room, and he replied only with a small private smile that I had long since learned to distrust. "You saw nothing else of interest, Watson. I saw a wronged gentleman and a jealous accuser. What more is there to see? A great deal, though I do not fault you for missing it, since it lies in the sort of detail your medical training has not schooled you to observe." He drew me toward the window out of earshot of the clerks. "You noted Vale's coat, an excellent garment, brushed to perfection. Yet the cuffs bore faint salt marks, of the kind left by sea air upon fine wool, and no amount of brushing entirely removes such staining. A man who claims to visit the docks only upon rare and unwelcome occasions should not carry the dock so persistently upon his sleeves. I confessed I had noticed nothing of the sort. There is more. You will recall that Vale signs his name with the right hand. I observed it upon the letter he showed us. Yet his left glove is markedly more worn at the fingers than his right. A man does not wear out a glove he scarcely uses, unless he uses it a great deal more than his manner would suggest. Perhaps he's left-handed for other tasks." "Perhaps," said Holmes, in a tone that conceded nothing. And then there was the moment when Captain Briggs, quite without design, used a nautical phrase, to box the compass, I believe it was, in some unrelated remark about the weather. Vale answered him before Briggs had finished the sentence, correcting a minor point of usage with the easy familiarity of a man who has spent years at sea, not the drawing-room acquaintance of a textile merchant who visits it rarely. I own that none of these observations had struck me as I sat in that comfortable room, listening to a gentleman recount his misfortunes with such evident sincerity. "You believe him a liar, then, Holmes?" "I believe," said he, drawing on his gloves as we stepped out into the grey afternoon, "that a convincing profession is often easier to manufacture than a convincing habit. Any man may learn to speak of textiles and Antwerp trade with tolerable fluency in a matter of weeks. It is a far harder thing to unlearn the small movements of a life spent otherwise, the set of the shoulders, the readiness of the hand, the vocabulary that rises unbidden before the schooled tongue can suppress it." We walked some way along the river in silence, the masts of 100 vessels black against the fading light, before Holmes spoke again. "Sir Edmund fears a scandal touching his firm's honesty. I begin to suspect the truth touches something a good deal more personal than commerce, Watson, and a good deal older than this month's manifest. But we have not yet enough thread to follow the pattern to its source. That, I think, will require patience, and, I fear, before very long, a further and less comfortable discovery." I did not then guess how soon, nor how grim, that discovery would prove to be. Chapter 3. The Death in the Chart Room. It was 2 nights later that the affair took its darker turn, and I have often reflected since how quickly the placid waters of commercial fraud can close over a man's head, and reveal beneath their calm surface a current altogether more deadly. A telegram reached Baker Street shortly after 8 in the morning, dispatched by Lestrade in terms of unusual brevity. Briggs found dead aboard Caledonia. Chart room locked from within. Come at once. Holmes read it twice, his face betraying nothing beyond a certain sharpening of the eye, and within the quarter hour we were in a cab rattling eastward through streets still wrapped in the last grey rags of the morning mist. The Caledonia lay at her berth much as she had lain when last we saw her, save that a constable now stood at the head of the gangway, and a knot of subdued sailors had gathered upon the deck, speaking in the low, uneasy tones that death always seems to summon even from those who have seen a great deal of it. Lestrade met us at the door of the chart-room, his usually brisk manner subdued. "It's an ugly business, Mr. Holmes. The steward found him this morning when Briggs failed to answer his knock. The door was locked from the inside and we had to force it. No sign that anyone came in by the window. It's scarcely large enough for a cat." The chart-room itself was a narrow, orderly chamber, its walls hung with charts of the Channel and the Dutch coast, a brass-bound desk beneath a single window, and the captain's body slumped across it, in an attitude I will not trouble the reader by describing too closely. A glass lay shattered upon the floor near the desk, its fragments scattered in a manner that suggested it had been flung rather than dropped, and upon the desk itself lay a photograph, torn cleanly in two, of a young woman whose face I didn't recognise. "A woman in it, you see," said Lestrade, not without satisfaction. "Jealousy, Mr. Holmes, or I'm a Dutchman, and I needn't tell you who was seen loitering near these very docks last evening." "Mercer," said Holmes without inflection. "Mercer indeed, and more than one witness heard him quarrelling with Briggs over Miss Clara only this week past. I'd say the case has solved itself." Holmes made no reply, but moved with that quiet, feline economy of motion I had so often observed in him to examine the room. He knelt first beside the captain's chair, running his fingers along the polished boards beneath it. "You will observe, Lestrade, that this chair has been drawn some inches from its habitual place. The varnish beneath its usual position is dulled by long contact with the chair's feet, here and here, while the boards where it now stands retain their full polish. A small matter, but a chair does not move itself, and a dying man clutching at his desk is unlikely to have shifted his seat with such deliberation." "Knocked in the struggle, perhaps," suggested Lestrade. "Perhaps," said Holmes, in the tone that I had learned to interpret as profound disagreement gently withheld. He rose and crossed to a coat hanging upon a hook behind the door, Briggs's own boat cloak, worn and salt-stiffened. From its folds he drew a pinch of ash and examined it beneath his lens. Tobacco, and of a blend I do not think Captain Briggs favoured. His pipe, I observe upon the desk, is charged with a coarser, darker shag. This ash is pale, fine-cut and expensive, the sort of tobacco a gentleman smokes, not a man who has spent 30 years upon the bridge of a merchant vessel. It was Holmes's final discovery, however, that seemed to arrest him longest. Lifting the blotting paper upon the desk, he uncovered a single sheet, folded once, upon which a hand had written a brief and startling message. "Vale, midnight. Bring the Antwerp record." Lestrade seized upon it at once. "There's your motive, plain as print, Mr. Holmes. Briggs meant to have it out with Vale over this business of the manifest, and something went wrong between them." "Or," said Holmes slowly, "someone wished us to believe as much." He carried the note to the window and studied it for a long while beneath the grey daylight, comparing it, page by page, with entries from the ship's log which Lestrade had thoughtfully preserved. I watched his face as he worked, and though I could read little in it, I sensed that some conclusion was forming behind that still, attentive mask. "The hand is Briggs's," he said at length, "or very nearly. The loops of the G, the slant of the capital letters, the pressure of the downstroke, all correspond with remarkable fidelity to his ordinary writing." "Then it settles the matter," said Lestrade with some impatience. "On the contrary, Inspector, it unsettles it entirely. Look here." Holmes laid the note beside a page from the log. "Captain Briggs, in every genuine specimen I can find, crosses his T's with a short, decisive stroke, always slightly above the letter's crown. A habit acquired, I should guess, from years of hurried entries made upon a rolling deck. In this note, the crossing is placed with unnatural precision, directly upon the stem in every instance. It is a fault no forger troubles himself to correct, because he does not know it exists to be corrected. He copies the shape of a hand. He does not copy its errors." "You mean it's a forgery?" "I mean," said Holmes, folding the paper carefully into his pocketbook, "that the amateur imitates the appearance of handwriting. The professional imitates its errors. Whoever wrote this note is neither amateur nor entirely professional. He is something more curious still. A man who has studied one hand so closely that he reproduces its virtues perfectly, while forgetting that a genuine hand is never without its small human imperfections." Lestrade frowned, plainly unconvinced, and turned away to give instructions to his constables regarding the pursuit of Julian Mercer, whose absence from his lodgings that morning had already been noted with suspicion. Holmes stood a moment longer beside the desk, looking down at the dead captain with an expression I can only describe as regretful, as though he read in that still figure not merely a puzzle to be solved, but a warning insufficiently heeded. "He knew something, Watson," said he quietly as we made our way back along the deck. "A man does not summon a midnight visitor and demand old records without cause. Briggs meant to confront someone with the truth he had carried, I think, for a very long time. The tragedy is that he mistook the danger of the confrontation until it was very nearly upon him." "Until it was upon him entirely," I corrected gently. "Just so," said Holmes, and said nothing more until we had regained the cab. Chapter 4. The Voice Behind the Door. The days that followed the discovery aboard the Caledonia were, for me, among the most bewildering of the whole affair, for every fresh fact seemed to contradict its predecessor, and I confess there were moments when I despaired of any pattern emerging from so tangled a skein. Holmes, however, moved through the confusion with an appetite that I had long since learned to recognise as the surest sign of a case worthy of his powers. He set himself, upon the morning after the inquest was opened, to reconstruct the captain's final hours, and to that end he interviewed one by one the crewmen who had been aboard the vessel that night. "There is a peculiar value, Watson, in questioning men who do not know what they know," said he, as we waited in the narrow companionway for the first of these witnesses. "A sailor rarely troubles himself to interpret what he hears. He simply hears it, and if you can persuade him to repeat the sound rather than his opinion of it, you may sometimes recover a truth that a cleverer witness would have already distorted by explanation." The first of the crewmen, a broad, weathered man named Tolliver, insisted stoutly that the voice raised behind the chart-room door that night had belonged to a rough sort of fellow, an East Londoner by his accent, coarse and quarrelsome. The second, a slighter youth who had been coiling rope not far from the door, was equally certain that the voice was that of an educated gentleman, its vowels careful and unhurried. The third, an old hand named Griggs, who had sailed the Rotterdam route for the better part of 20 years, would say only that he had caught, amid the general murmur of dispute, a foreign inflection upon the word cargo, pronounced in a manner he associated with Low Country merchants rather than Englishmen. Lestrade, who had gathered these same statements the previous day, dismissed the contradictions with a wave of his hand. "Sailors' memories, Mr. Holmes. Ask 3 men what they heard through a locked door, and you'll get 3 different stories, and none of them worth a farthing in a court of law. On the contrary, Inspector, I should say they are worth a very great deal, provided one does not ask which of the 3 is correct, but rather how all 3 might be true at once. How can a man be East London gentleman and Dutchman in the same quarter hour? That," said Holmes, with the faint satisfaction of a man approaching the heart of his subject, "is precisely the question I intend to answer." He turned again to each witness, and rather than asking them to characterize the voice, he asked them to repeat, as nearly as memory allowed, the very words they had heard. From Tolliver he drew a fragment. "You'll not see a penny of it, not from me." Delivered by the sailor's own halting imitation, in tones thick and glottal. From the youth came a different fragment entirely. "I have given you every consideration a gentleman could offer," rendered smooth and precise. Griggs, for his part, recalled only the single foreign-sounding word, isolated amid a rush of ordinary English. Holmes listened to all 3 with close attention, and when the men had gone, he turned to me with something very near excitement in his usually guarded countenance. "You perceive it now, Watson? These are not 3 different voices remembered imperfectly. They are one voice, deliberately shifted between 3 registers within the space of a single conversation. No genuine dispute proceeds in such a fashion. A man does not lapse from the dockside to the drawing room and back again unless he is performing each character for a purpose." "You mean there was but one visitor, playing several parts?" "I mean that our murderer possesses a talent I had not, until this moment, fully credited him with." There remained the question of how this visitor had come and gone unseen, and here Holmes's attention turned to Captain Briggs's boots, examined now more carefully than the excitement of the discovery had earlier permitted. Embedded in the heel of the left boot was a quantity of fine, pale clay, quite unlike the black mud of the ordinary dockside, and Holmes spent the better part of an hour tracing its likely origin along the wharves before he found its match near a narrow, seldom-used service entrance connecting the docks to a warehouse in the ownership of Harcourt and Bell. Within that warehouse, among crates and coiled rope, and the general clutter of maritime storage, we discovered a discarded black overcoat and a cheap cloth cap thrust hastily behind a stack of barrels. "There's your disguise, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, who had accompanied us, and now regarded the garments with open triumph. Mercer got himself up as a labourer to move about unremarked. "It's plain enough now." Holmes lifted the coat and turned it slowly beneath the warehouse's single hanging lamp, running his fingers along the fabric with an attention that plainly puzzled the inspector. "Observe the coal dust worked into the weave, Lestrade. A genuine labourer's coat accumulates such grime by degrees, over months, unevenly, wherever the wearer's daily work happens to bring him into contact with soot and cargo. This dust has been applied deliberately, rubbed in with the flat of a hand, thickest at the elbows and collar where a casual eye would expect to find it, thinnest where such an eye would never think to look. The seams beneath are quite new. This garment has never done a day's honest labour in its life." "A costume, then," said I. "A costume," Holmes agreed, "purchased and prepared for a single performance." It was that same afternoon that we learned, through Lestrade's inquiries, that Clara Mercer had at last admitted, with evident reluctance, that Captain Briggs had once shown her a measure of gentle attention some years before, a fact which, laid beside her brother's known animosity toward Vale, seemed only to thicken the case against young Mercer in the eyes of the police. I own that I found myself, against my better judgment, inclining once more toward the theory of a jealous and desperate young man. Holmes did not share my inclination. "The evidence," said he, as we walked back through the gathering dusk, "contains too much theatre, Watson. Real crimes of passion are clumsy, hurried, and full of accident. This one has been rehearsed." Chapter 5. Tears at Leadenhall Street. Holmes determined upon the following morning that the time had come to examine each of the principal witnesses apart from the others, for as he remarked over a hurried breakfast, "A story tested in company is a rehearsed thing, Watson. Separate the players, and you separate also the temptation to perform for one another." We found Clara Mercer at her aunt's house near Leadenhall Street, a slight, fair young woman whose grief for her brother's disappearance had plainly worn upon her these past days, beyond any pretence of composure. She wept twice during our brief interview, contradicted herself upon the hour at which she had last seen Julian, and could not, when pressed, say with any certainty what he had been wearing when he left her. "She is honest," said Holmes once we had taken our leave, "and her honesty lies precisely in her inconsistency. Grief does not keep an orderly ledger, Watson. It was upon the trivial details, the hour, the coat, that she faltered, and upon the matters that touched her heart most nearly that she remained firm throughout. That is the pattern of genuine feeling. A performance, by contrast, is generally most careful where truth is most careless. Julian Mercer himself we ran to earth at the customs house, where he had not yet been taken into custody, though Lestrade's men watched him closely. He received us with an anger so unguarded that I half expected him to strike the table between us. "You may believe what you please of me, Mr. Holmes, but I'll not have my sister's name dragged through every gutter in London because that man chose to amuse himself with her affections and then cast her aside like a soiled glove." His fists were clenched, his colour high, and though his fury was directed chiefly against Vale, I observed that not once did he speak in his own defence, nor trouble himself to protest his innocence of Briggs's death, so entirely was his mind consumed with his sister's honour. "His anger is genuine also," Holmes remarked afterward, "and observe where it is aimed, Watson. A guilty man defends himself first and his family second. This young man has not troubled to defend himself at all." It was our third interview, however, that Holmes had plainly reserved as the true test of the day. We found Adrian Vale once more at the offices of Harcourt and Bell, composed as ever, his grey gloves laid neatly upon the table beside him. "A dreadful business," said he, when Holmes informed him of Captain Briggs's death, and here I must record that his performance, if performance it was, struck me as beyond reproach. His voice dropped to the appropriate register of solemnity. He paused a moment, as though overcome, before asking in careful sequence whether the police suspected foul play, whether the family had been informed, and whether he himself might be of any service to the widow. "He asks precisely what an innocent man would ask," I whispered to Holmes, as Vale turned aside a moment to compose himself. "He asks precisely what an innocent man is expected to ask," Holmes murmured in reply, "which is not at all the same accomplishment." It was at this point that Holmes, with the air of a man imparting confidential information out of mere courtesy, remarked to Vale that Captain Briggs was believed to have concealed, somewhere aboard the Caledonia, a second passenger record from an earlier Antwerp voyage, a document Holmes suggested that the police had not yet succeeded in locating. I watched Vale closely, having by now some notion of what Holmes intended, and I confess I saw nothing whatever in his face to betray him. He received the intelligence with the same grave composure as before, expressed a mild hope that the record, if it existed, might soon be found, and turned the conversation smoothly toward the progress of the inquest. It was only as we rose to leave, some minutes later, that I observed what Holmes, I am certain, had been watching for from the first. Vale's walking stick, which he had held throughout our interview loosely in his right hand, was now gripped, quite without his apparent notice, in his left. The fingers curled about its silver head, with a firmness that seemed to answer some private anxiety his face had refused to show. "You saw it," said Holmes, once we were again upon the street. "The stick, you mean? What of it?" "A man at ease does not change hands upon his own walking stick in the course of an idle conversation, Watson, unless some sudden tension has disturbed the balance of his composure. I gave him a piece of false intelligence. There is no second record, nor any suggestion that one exists, and his tongue betrayed nothing. His hand was less disciplined." We had scarcely finished this exchange when we came upon Percival Shaw, the chief clerk, engaged in his endless labour among the company's ledgers, and Holmes turned his attention, for the remainder of the afternoon, to the more prosaic business of the manifest itself. Shaw explained with the patient exactness of a man devoted to his craft that passenger entries were customarily prepared according to a fixed set of abbreviations, understood throughout the office and altered but rarely across the years. Beside the disputed entry for Adrian Vale, however, appeared a notation that puzzled him, the letters Transant, signifying, as he informed us, that the passenger had been transferred at Antwerp from another vessel. "And who employs this abbreviation now, Mr. Shaw?" Holmes inquired. Shaw considered a moment before answering. "No one now, Mr. Holmes. It fell out of use a dozen years since. Captain Briggs used it in his early days as a junior officer, before the company adopted its present forms. I have not seen it upon a manifest in all my time here." Holmes received this intelligence in silence, though I saw his eyes brighten with the particular light that told me a fact of consequence had been laid before him. "Someone forged that entry, Watson," said he, as we walked away from Leadenhall Street through the gathering dusk, "who knew not merely the present practice of Harcourt and Bell, but an obsolete habit belonging to Captain Briggs's earlier career, a habit that even the company's own clerk had all but forgotten. That is not the knowledge of a jealous customs officer nursing a private grievance. That is the knowledge of a man who has studied Nathaniel Briggs, Watson, and studied him for a very long time indeed." Chapter 6. The Passenger Who Never Was. Holmes dispatched me upon the following day to verify the whole fabric of Adrian Vale's commercial history, a task I undertook with the diligence of a man who has learned, through long association, that no detail is too dull to reward patient inquiry. I visited his offices near Leadenhall Street, where a clerk of his own showed me ledgers, correspondence, and shipping invoices reaching back some years. I called upon his bankers, who confirmed accounts of respectable standing and regular deposit. I made the round of 2 clubs to which he belonged, and found his membership attested by gentlemen who spoke of him with the easy warmth reserved for a familiar and well-liked acquaintance. Every fact I gathered was, upon its face, entirely genuine. The offices existed. The invoices bore the marks of real transactions. The bankers were not men to be deceived in so plain a matter as an account's history. And yet, as I pursued the thread further back, I began to notice what I can only describe as an absence where there ought to have been substance. Beyond a period of some 4 years, the record of Adrian Vale simply ceased. No earlier lease, no earlier banker, no earlier acquaintance could be found who professed to have known him before that date. He had appeared, as it were, fully formed, a gentleman of 30-odd years with no boyhood, no schooling, no family that any could name. I laid this intelligence before Holmes that evening with no small satisfaction, for I flattered myself I had uncovered something of moment, and I was not disappointed by his reception of it. 4 years, Watson," said he, setting down his pipe. "That accords very well with a discovery of my own, gathered this afternoon from a source a good deal less respectable than your bankers and club secretaries." He had spent the day, it transpired, among old newspaper files and the dustier records of the Board of Trade, pursuing a matter that had occurred to him during our conversation with Captain Briggs some days before, namely, the captain's earlier career prior to his command of the Caledonia. 12 years ago, said Holmes, Briggs served as first officer aboard the SS Morning Star, a vessel that went down with heavy loss of life after clearing Rotterdam in a gale. The inquiry that followed was a troubled one, Watson, for it emerged that certain cargo records aboard her had been falsified, apparently to conceal an insurance fraud of some magnitude. Suspicion fell upon a junior purser, a young man named Elias Venn, who vanished in the confusion following the wreck and was never afterward traced. His body was never recovered, and the general presumption, in the absence of better evidence, was that he had drowned along with a number of his shipmates. You believe this Venn to be connected with our present affair? I believe it worth the asking, Watson, and I have taken the liberty of procuring, from the Board of Trade's records, an old crew photograph taken shortly before the Morning Star sailed upon her final voyage. He produced it now, a small faded print, somewhat foxed at the edges, showing a dozen officers and crew arranged upon a deck in the stiff, unsmiling attitude such photographs commonly demand. Holmes indicated a slight young man standing near the rail, his features indistinct with age and poor exposure. That is Elias Venn. I studied the print a long while, and confess I could trace in it little resemblance to the composed gentleman we had twice interviewed at Leadenhall Street. The face was younger, thinner, framed by hair worn in a fashion long since abandoned, and disfigured, moreover, by a heavy moustache of the sort no longer favoured by men of Vale's evident taste. Holmes, however, took a sheet of paper and, with a few strokes of pencil, covered the hair, the moustache, and the collar of the old photograph, leaving visible only the bare structure of brow, ear, and jaw. "Now, Watson." I looked again, and felt, I confess, a small chill pass along my spine, for the resemblance, thus isolated from the disguising particulars of fashion and years, was striking indeed. The same set of the ear against the skull, the same angle where jaw met throat, features that no tailor nor barber can materially alter, however completely he may transform the face that surrounds them. "You believe Vale to be Ven." "I believe the possibility can no longer be set aside," said Holmes. "And I have this day resolved a smaller puzzle that has troubled me since our first visit to the Caledonia, the salt staining upon Vale's coat, which he would have us believe was acquired through some innocent proximity to the docks. I have consulted a chemist of my acquaintance, who examined a fibre I contrived to secure from the garment during our last interview. This staining, Watson, is not that of ordinary sea-water at all, but a residue peculiar to vessels carrying preserved hides and certain industrial salts in bulk, precisely the sort of cargo a merchant ship of the Morning Star's trade would have carried, and precisely the sort of staining a man might acquire not from a rare and reluctant visit to the wharves, but from years spent in the hold and upon the deck of just such a vessel. Then Vale understands shipping far better than he has admitted to us." "He understands it," said Holmes, "as a man understands the language of his own childhood, imperfectly forgotten, however carefully disguised." I sat some time in silence, turning the small photograph in my hands, struck by the strangeness of a man who might have spent 4 years constructing, brick upon careful brick, an entire edifice of respectable existence, while beneath it lay concealed the whole of an earlier and less fortunate life. But why Holmes? Why should Ven, if Ven he is, trouble to become Vale at all? A man presumed drowned might simply have vanished into some quiet obscurity and lived out his days unmolested. Holmes rose and stood a while before the fire, his hands clasped behind him, in the attitude I had come to associate with his deepest reflections. Because obscurity, Watson, offers no protection against the particular danger that comes of being recognised by chance upon a public street. To become respectable, truly, unimpeachably respectable, is to become invisible in a manner obscurity can never achieve. No one troubles to ask a prosperous city merchant who he was before he was prosperous. It is only the poor and the furtive whom the world insists on interrogating. Ven did not wish merely to disappear. He wished to become a man so far above suspicion that no one would ever again think to ask who he had been. Chapter 7. The Confession of Julian Mercer. I had supposed, after the discoveries of the previous evening, that our investigation had entered its final and most delicate phase, in which Holmes must proceed with all caution against a man of considerable cunning. I was not prepared for the news that greeted us upon the following morning, brought to Baker Street in person by an unusually animated Lestrade. "It's over, Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself without ceremony and producing from his breast pocket a folded letter. "Mercer's bolted and left this behind him for anyone with eyes to find." Holmes took the letter and read it through with an attention that betrayed nothing of his private thoughts, while I looked over his shoulder at the cramped, agitated hand in which it was written. It was in substance a full confession that Julian Mercer had, in a fit of jealous rage against Adrian Vale for the humiliation of his sister, altered the manifest of the Caledonia to implicate him in a scheme he had not committed, and that Captain Briggs, discovering the imposture, had confronted him aboard the vessel and paid for the discovery with his life. His own hand, Mr. Holmes, sworn to by 2 who know it well, and his own pen and paper besides, taken from his very lodgings. A porter at the London Bridge station reports a man of his description boarding the late train, travelling alone and in evident haste. Even Miss Mercer, though it grieves her sorely, allows that certain turns of phrase are her brother's own manner of speech. The case, then, is closed to your satisfaction, Inspector. Closed as a coffin lid, Mr. Holmes, and Sir Edmund will sleep the easier for it. He's already sent word to the newspapers that the company's good name stands vindicated. Lestrade permitted himself a small, triumphant smile. I'll not pretend I'm sorry to have it settled without further trouble to Mr. Vale, who has borne this business with more patience than most men would show under such suspicion. I confess that I too felt a measure of relief at so tidy a resolution, and remarked as much to Holmes once Lestrade had taken his leave, well pleased with himself, to set the machinery of pursuit in motion toward the Channel ports. You consider the matter concluded, Watson? I own I had begun to think so, though I had not expected the confession to come so conveniently nor so entire. Nor had I, said Holmes, and there was in his voice a quality I had learned to recognise as the herald of contradiction. He drew the letter once more from his pocket-book and studied it beneath the lamp, his brow drawn in close attention. You will observe this sentence, Watson. He read aloud slowly. I altered the manifest aboard the Caledonia before she cleared Antwerp harbour. What of it? It states plainly enough what was done. It states what was done in a manner no customs official would ever employ. Holmes set the letter down and regarded me with the faint, satisfied smile of a man approaching the solution of a puzzle he had long suspected. Consider, Watson, the actual mechanics of Mercer's profession. A manifest is not altered aboard a vessel before she clears harbour in any sense that a customs man would recognise, for the very reason that the manifest, once prepared, passes into the custody of the customs house itself for inspection and clearance. It does not remain aboard ship to be tampered with at the captain's leisure. Mercer, of all men, would know precisely at what point in its passage the document became vulnerable, for he told us himself, upon our first visit, that the vulnerable interval lay at the customs office, not the ship. Yet this letter speaks of the alteration occurring aboard the vessel before her clearance, a description that betrays not the practised knowledge of a customs officer, but the imprecise imagination of an outsider who understands ships very well and customs procedure scarcely at all. I turned the words over in my mind, and felt the tidy structure of Lestrade's solution begin once more to totter. A sailor's error, you mean, dressed up as a clerk's confession? Precisely so. The confession was written by a man thoroughly at home upon a ship's deck, and only superficially acquainted with the customs house, which is to say, Watson, written by a man very nearly the opposite of Julian Mercer in every particular of relevant experience. But the handwriting, Holmes? Lestrade said it had been authenticated, and even Clara Mercer allowed certain phrases to resemble her brother's manner. A manner may be studied and reproduced, as we have already seen in the case of Captain Briggs's note, and handwriting copied closely enough to deceive a hurried comparison, particularly when the comparer wishes, however unconsciously, to be deceived. Recall also, Watson, that our friend Vale possesses a talent for voices we have already had occasion to admire. The East London labourer, the educated gentleman, the Low Country inflection, all summoned and dismissed within the same quarter hour behind a locked door. Is it so great a step from mimicking a man's speech to mimicking his pen? Then Mercer did not write this confession. I think it exceedingly unlikely, and I think it yet more unlikely that Mercer boarded any train from London Bridge of his own free will and in his own untroubled person. I sat back, considerably shaken by the implications of this reasoning, for if Holmes were correct, then Julian Mercer's disappearance was no flight from justice, but something a great deal more sinister, an abduction, perhaps, dressed with elaborate care in the costume of a guilty man's escape. What has become of him, then? If he didn't flee? That, Watson, is precisely what I intend to discover, and I confess I am not sanguine as to the ease of the search. A man capable of the deceptions we have already traced, the forged note, the shifting voices, the manufactured costume, and now, I believe, a confession neither written nor spoken by its supposed author, is not a man who leaves his handiwork carelessly finished. We must move with corresponding care, or we shall find that our quarry has prepared some further deception to greet our discovery. He rose and crossed to the window, looking down into the darkening street where the lamps were being lit one by one against the early winter dusk. Sir Edmund believes the matter closed, and Lestrade has telegraphed every port from Dover to Harwich in pursuit of a man who is very possibly at this hour lying bound and silent within a mile of where we sit. It is a curious feature of this case, Watson, that its solution has so far consisted chiefly in disbelieving what everyone else has been most eager to accept. Chapter 8. The Man at Dover. News reached Baker Street upon the second morning following Mercer's disappearance that a man answering his description had been observed near the harbour at Dover, and that his coat, hat, and an unused railway ticket had been discovered abandoned close by the water's edge, as though their owner had cast them aside in some final desperate bid to vanish across the channel unrecognised. Lestrade arrived in a state of considerable satisfaction, the discovery having confirmed, in his estimation, every particular of the theory he had held from the first. "He's made for France, Mr. Holmes, sure as I'm standing here. Left his coat and hat rather than carry anything that might mark him out, and no doubt paid some fishermen to run him across under cover of dark. I've had every packet watched since dawn, and word sent along the coast besides." Holmes received this intelligence with a courtesy that did not, I think, deceive Lestrade so much as it plainly irritated him, for my friend's first question concerned not the coat nor the hat, but a pair of boots discovered near the same spot which the inspector had mentioned only in passing, as a matter of small importance. "You will permit me to examine them, Lestrade? They're Mercer's boots as much as the coat is Mercer's coat, if that's your meaning, found within a yard of each other." Nevertheless he consented, and within the hour we stood together in the small room at the yard where the recovered articles had been laid out upon a table, orderly as the exhibits at some grim auction. Holmes took up the boots and turned them over with care, examining the soles beneath his lens for some minutes before he spoke. "The coat fits Mercer, as you say, and the hat likewise. But these boots, Lestrade, were never worn by any customs officer walking the level ground of a dockside office. Observe the wear along the outer edges of each sole, here and here, worn to an angle no ordinary gait produces. That is the wear of a man long accustomed to balancing upon a rolling deck, where the body learns, through sheer repetition, to plant its weight upon the outer foot against the ship's constant motion. Mercer, whatever his failings, has spent his working life upon solid quays and in customs offices. These boots belonged to a sailor." Lestrade's confidence wavered visibly, though he was not a man to surrender a comfortable theory without a struggle. "A borrowed pair, perhaps, or bought second-hand." "Perhaps," said Holmes, in the tone that I had come to recognise as reserving judgment entirely, "though I confess I incline toward a simpler explanation, that these boots were never Mercer's at all, but were left here by the same hand that arranged the coat and hat to complete a picture of flight that Mercer himself had no part in painting." He said little more upon the subject that day, but I observed upon our return to Baker Street that he passed the evening in close study of the tide tables, and the shipping notices once more spread across his desk, much as I had found him occupied upon the very first evening of this affair. It was upon the following day that Holmes proposed we visit the Caledonia. Once more, a suggestion Lestrade, still smarting somewhat from the matter of the boots, received with less enthusiasm than he might otherwise have shown. "What can there be left to find aboard her, Mr. Holmes? She's been searched top to bottom since Briggs was found." "Searched, no doubt, for what a policeman expects to find aboard a ship, Inspector. I propose to search for what a very particular sort of passenger might have left behind him. Our search, conducted through the narrower and less frequented recesses of the vessel, led us at length to a small storage compartment near the crew's quarters, seldom used and littered with the odds and ends of long voyages. Here, wedged behind a coil of spare rope, Holmes discovered a small tin box, and within it a quantity of theatrical spirit gum, several vials of hair dye in shades ranging from black to a reddish brown, and the fragments of what had evidently once been a false moustache, now crushed beyond repair. "The apparatus of transformation, Watson," said he, holding the box up to the light with something very like satisfaction. "A man who can become, within the space of an hour, A rough dockside labourer or a foreign sailor scarcely needs the assistance of nature to alter his appearance, so long as he carries such tools as these about him. It was a crewman we questioned afterward, a quiet man named Diggory who had served aboard the Caledonia for some years, who furnished the final piece of the puzzle we had not thought to seek. He recalled, upon being pressed, that Mr. Adrian Vale had once visited the ship some months before, wrapped in a heavy scarf and wearing spectacles he did not commonly affect, explaining to any who asked that he suffered from a severe cold that winter's evening. A cold that concealed rather more of his face than his throat, I should imagine, Holmes remarked, when Diggory had gone about his duties once more. We stood together upon the deck as the light failed, the river running dark and busy beyond the rail, and I confess that the full scope of what we had uncovered pressed upon me with a weight I had not felt since the earliest days of our association. You believe, then, that Vale has done all this? The forged note, the shifting voices, the labourer's disguise, the false confession, and now the boots at Dover, entirely alone? I believe, Watson, that we have been pursuing not a single crime but a method, practised and perfected across a period of years, of which the Caledonia's manifest was merely the latest and most desperate application. Vale has not forged one document. He has forged an entire existence, brick upon careful brick, and when that existence was threatened by a man who remembered too well who he had once been, he employed the same talent that had built his respectability to destroy the one witness who could unmake it. And Mercer, I am now very nearly certain, lives yet, hidden away to serve as the scapegoat for a crime he did not commit, until such time as our friend Vale judges it safe to arrange some final and permanent silence. Holmes turned from the rail, his face set in an expression I had seen upon it before only when the stakes of a case had grown, in his estimation, dangerously pressing. We have very little time, Watson, and a great deal yet to prove. I mean to gather every soul connected with this affair beneath one roof, and I mean to have that old photograph of the Morning Star's crew laid upon the table before them. Chapter 9. The Identity of Adrian Vale. The company that assembled the following afternoon in the panelled boardroom of Harcourt and Bell was as curious a gathering as I have witnessed in the whole course of my association with Sherlock Holmes. Sir Edmund Harcourt sat at the head of the long table, his dignity somewhat frayed by the strain of the preceding fortnight. Beside him sat Miss Eleanor Bell, composed and watchful. Percival Shaw occupied a chair near the window, his ledgers set aside for once. Clara Mercer, pale and anxious, had been persuaded to attend at Holmes's particular request, and Lestrade stood near the door with the air of a man prepared to be sceptical until the last possible moment. Adrian Vale sat somewhat apart from the others, composed as ever, his grey gloves resting upon his knee. Holmes stood before the fireplace, and upon the table before him lay a small, faded photograph, face downward, which he did not at first disturb. "I have asked you here," he began, "to bring to a close a matter that has occupied us for a fortnight, and which has cost, I am sorry to say, one man his life, and another a period of confinement he did not deserve. I may tell you at once that Julian Mercer did not forge the manifest of the Caledonia, did not murder Captain Briggs, and did not flee to Dover in fear of discovery." A murmur ran round the table, and Clara Mercer's hand rose to her throat. "He is alive?" she asked, in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "I believe so, Miss Mercer, and I believe we shall have him restored to you within the day, once certain arrangements now in progress have borne their fruit." Holmes did not pause upon this assurance, though I saw the effect it produced upon her, but turned instead to the heart of his explanation. The forged entry upon the manifest, the death of Captain Briggs, the elaborate disguise discovered in the warehouse, the false confession, and the staged flight at Dover were none of them the work of Julian Mercer. They were the work of a single hand, practised over years in the art of becoming convincingly whatever person the occasion required. "You accuse someone in this room," said Sir Edmund, his voice tight. "I accuse Mr. Adrian Vale," said Holmes, though I ought properly to address him by a name he abandoned some 12 years ago, upon the deck of a sinking vessel in the North Sea, Elias Venn. The silence that followed was of a quality I have rarely encountered, not the silence of disbelief, but the peculiar stillness of a room in which every eye has turned, almost against its will, toward a single face. Vale did not move. His composure, which had carried him through every previous trial with such flawless assurance, seemed for the first time to require conscious effort to maintain. "This is a fantastic accusation, Mr. Holmes," said he at last, his voice low and level. "I have never heard the name before in my life." "Then permit me to refresh your acquaintance with it." Holmes turned the photograph face upward upon the table. 12 years ago, the Morning Star went down off the Dutch coast, and among her survivors was a junior purser suspected, though never proven, of falsifying cargo records in connection with an insurance fraud. That man vanished in the confusion of the wreck and was presumed drowned. Captain Briggs, then first officer of the same vessel, believed as much himself, until upon a recent voyage to Antwerp he encountered, in the person of a prosperous textile merchant, a face he had thought consigned to the sea 12 years before. "You cannot seriously propose," Vale began, but Holmes continued without pause, as a man continues who has built his argument too carefully to be interrupted. "Briggs, I believe, had once helped conceal the extent of Venn's involvement in that old fraud, out of some measure of pity for a young man he believed already dead to the world. When he discovered Venn alive, and prospering under a name and reputation entirely fabricated, he demanded proof of the old Antwerp dealings, records that would have exposed the whole history of the deception. It was to silence that demand, and to secure his newly built existence, that Venn forged the Caledonia's Manifest, creating an official record to support his fabricated history, and when Briggs pressed him further, killed him in the locked chart room, and arranged the scene to suggest a confrontation born of jealousy over Miss Mercer." Holmes proceeded methodically to lay before the company the whole structure of the deception, the shifting voice heard through the chart-room door, at once East London labourer, educated gentleman, and low-country sailor, the coat rubbed with coal dust to counterfeit long wear, the confession written in a sailor's phrase masquerading as a customs man's account, the boots left at Dover, worn in the manner of a man long accustomed to a rolling deck. "Each of these," said Holmes, "was a variation upon a single talent, practised, I should imagine, across many years and many smaller deceptions before it was ever turned to so desperate a purpose. Even the gentleman who sits among us now, composed, correct, and utterly convincing, is himself but the longest and most successful of these impersonations." "And what proof?" said Vale, his voice now edged with something harder than his earlier composure. "Have you beyond an old photograph and a quantity of theory?" "I have this," said Holmes, and drew from his pocket a small case, from which he produced a folded medical certificate, procured, as he later explained to me, from the old records of the Morning Star inquiry. Elias Venn injured his left hand during the sinking of that vessel, a fact recorded at the time by the surgeon who examined the survivors. The injury left a permanent weakness in 2 fingers, sufficient to alter, in small but lasting ways, the manner in which the hand performs any delicate or unaccustomed task. You write, Mr. Vale, with your right hand, as any careful man of business must learn to do if his left proves unreliable. But I observed, upon our very first meeting, that your left glove was worn beyond any proportion your ordinary habits would explain, and I have observed since that whenever a task requires an unconscious grip, a walking stick seized in a moment of sudden anxiety, for instance, you resort, without thinking, to a peculiar compensating hold of the left hand, favouring the 2 central fingers over the last, precisely as a man must who has lost the full use of them. Vale's gloved hand, resting upon the table, closed slowly into just such a grip, as though his own body had risen in evidence against him. Adrian Vale, said Holmes not unkindly, has impeccable references, excellent credit, admirable manners, and a flawless reputation. His single disadvantage, Mr. Venn, is that he has never existed. The composure that had sustained our adversary through every previous encounter broke at last, not in violence, but in a kind of collapse. The collapse of a man who has held a single, exhausting posture for so many years that its abandonment leaves him for a moment entirely without shape. Lestrade moved forward from the door, and within a few brief words the arrest was made. Chapter 10. The Names We Trust. Julian Mercer was found that same evening, alive though considerably weakened, confined within a shabby riverside lodging some distance below the docks, where Venn had kept him bound and silent against the day when his supposed confession and flight might be conveniently discovered and believed. He had been given a little food and less light, and I was summoned in my professional capacity to attend him before he was permitted to return to his sister's care. He proved, upon examination, to have suffered chiefly from cold and want of nourishment, and I was able to assure Clara Mercer, when she arrived white-faced and trembling at the lodging-house door, that her brother would recover his strength within a fortnight, given rest and proper feeding. The days that followed brought a general unravelling of the fabric Venn had woven with such patience across 4 laborious years. Mercer's name was cleared entirely. The confession found among his papers exposed before the magistrates as a forgery of remarkable but ultimately traceable skill. Sir Edmund Harcourt, to his considerable credit, called personally upon Clara Mercer to offer a formal apology on behalf of his firm, an act of contrition I thought handsomely done, given how near the scandal had come to ruining the very reputation he sought to protect. Captain Briggs's memory underwent a quieter but no less significant reconsideration. It became known in the course of the inquiry that he had once concealed a measure of Venn's guilt in the old Morning Star affair, believing the young man already lost to the sea and beyond any further reckoning. It was a kindness that had cost him dearly in the end, and yet I confess I could not find it in myself to think the less of him for it. A man may misjudge the mercy he extends without forfeiting the credit of having extended it at all. He believed the debt closed by death, Watson, Holmes observed, when I remarked upon this to him some days later. It is a common enough error to suppose that the past, once buried, remains so. Venn taught him otherwise, and taught him at the greatest possible cost. Harcourt and Bell survived the scandal that had so alarmed Sir Edmund at our first interview, and survived it, I think, rather better than he had dared hope. Holmes's careful distinction, laid before the newspapers and the government negotiators alike, between the actions of a single fraudulent individual and the honest conduct of the firm that had unwittingly employed his custom, did much to preserve the company's standing, and the mail contract, I am given to understand, was concluded upon terms scarcely altered from those originally proposed. Percival Shaw, whose recollection of an obsolete notation had furnished Holmes with one of his earliest and most valuable threads, received a promotion to chief clerk in recognition, though he himself, being a modest man, ascribed the whole credit to good fortune rather than any particular acuity of his own. "I only remembered an old habit of the captain's, Doctor," said he, when I called upon him to convey Holmes's compliments. "I hardly call that detective work." I did not trouble to correct him, for I have observed, in the course of many such cases, that the men whose small and unglamorous observations prove most decisive are very often the last to credit themselves with any particular insight. As for the fabricated existence of Adrian Vale, investigators employed by the Board of Trade spent the better part of a month dismantling what Venn had constructed with such extraordinary patience. The offices near Leadenhall Street, it emerged, had been rented under careful and gradually accumulated pretences. The invoices, though representing genuine transactions, had been built up slowly, one small and unremarkable dealing at a time, until they formed, in aggregate, the appearance of a substantial and long-established business. The club memberships had been secured through paid introductions and calculated attendance at precisely those dinners and gatherings most likely to bring him into contact with men whose good opinion once given was rarely afterward questioned. 4 years, Watson, said Holmes when the full extent of the deception had at last been catalogued. To build what a man of honest character requires no effort at all to possess. There is something in that disproportion worth remembering. We sat that evening in our old chairs at Baker Street, the fire burning low, the fog once more pressing close against the windows as it had upon the night this whole affair began. I found myself turning over, in the quiet of my own thoughts, the strange persuasiveness of Adrian Vale, his correct speech, his excellent tailoring, his unimpeachable references, all of it accepted without question by men and women of considerable intelligence and worldly experience, myself not least among them. "It troubles me, Holmes," I said at length, "how easily we were all of us taken in. Sir Edmund, Lestrade, myself. We saw a gentleman of good manners and sound credit, and we asked no further questions of him than his manners and his credit seemed to invite. You describe, Watson, not a failure of intelligence but a habit of society," said Holmes, refilling his pipe with the unhurried care he brought to every small task. "We are taught from childhood to read a man's coat, his speech, and his company as evidence of his character, and for the greater part of our dealings, the reading serves us tolerably well. It is only the rare and patient deceiver who learns to forge not merely a signature or a document, but an entire pattern of evidence, cultivated over years until it becomes, to any ordinary scrutiny, indistinguishable from the genuine article. Then reputation itself becomes a kind of forgery, if a man is patient enough to manufacture it. Reputation, Watson, is very often nothing more than testimony repeated until it is mistaken for proof. Most men repeat it honestly, having no reason to doubt what 100 others have already accepted before them. It requires a rare and calculating mind to perceive that this very honesty, multiplied across enough respectable witnesses, may be turned into the most effective disguise a man could wish for. He said no more upon the subject, but took up his violin and drew from it some low, wandering air that seemed to answer, in its own wordless fashion, the melancholy turn our conversation had taken. I watched the fog thicken beyond the glass, hiding from view the great sprawl of the city beyond, its millions of names, its countless professions and faces, each one accepted for the most part upon nothing more substantial than the confidence with which it was presented. It was, I reflected, the strangest feature of the whole affair, stranger even than the elaborate machinery of Ven's deception. It was not that one resourceful man had successfully invented Adrian Vale. It was that so many honest and respectable people had helped him complete the invention, simply by believing, as we are all of us inclined to believe, in the comfortable evidence of a well-cut coat and an easy manner. The end.